Beth Tener, thanks so much for joining the We Rise podcast. So delighted to have you on today. We were connected actually by Allison Kinsey of Podcasting for Creative. So it's really fun for me to make connections with, through the world of podcasting, but also with people who, there's an inkling of connection. So we're just excited to share more about your story with listeners today. Will you introduce yourself so folks know who I have the delight of speaking to today?
Sure. Thanks so much for having me. My name is Beth Tener, and I live in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and have lived kind of in New England most of my life.
Mm-hmm.
So I was so glad to meet you and see your website because I
Yeah.
feel like it was a co-arising of very
Mm-hmm.
similar interests and work in different parts of the country, but similar paths. So my work in the world, I've always been really concerned about what's happening in the planet. And then I've also been always really attending to like, how is it that we think and what's in our mindset and how do we work together? And how do all those things relate? And so I've done a lot of work over the years in organizational change, community development, around sustainability, trained in permaculture like you are, I believe.
Yay! Mm-hmm.
Yeah, like, and a lot in the last few years on collaborative networks and
Mm-hmm.
anti-racism, and working across sector and within organizations and a lot of cross-organization work. So
Awesome.
I'll start
Love
there.
that. So it
Yeah.
sounds like desire to make connections, create change. You have a lot of solid skills, but you've also are looking at systems level change a little bit. It sounded like we had a chance to catch up a couple days ago by phone, and it sounded like you're really looking at how to build a different layer of change within communities. Can you talk a little bit more about what does your work look like in the day to day? How have you worked with communities or with individuals, either around sustainability or facilitating? Tell us a little bit more about your work and also your story. How'd you get to this point?
Well, maybe I'll start with my story.
Yeah, great.
So I was lucky enough to go to college, and out of college, I got a job with a pretty big consulting firm that did a lot around it was around environmental compliance. So I worked
Mm-hmm.
with many different companies in different, going to one week to a factory, one week to a pipeline or a cruise ship. I was a
Great.
lot of travel, but
Yeah.
I had this chance to kind of look at a lot of different organizations and systems. So it was a fascinating training and understanding culture and human behavior and
Mm.
how systems work, because you really would
Yeah.
just see the same systemic situation, different context, different people, but the same story, like
Mm-hmm.
week after week.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've always been fascinated by that.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea of like what you're seeing as the behavior in the world is affected by what's underneath, like what happened in
Mm-hmm.
the past,
Right.
what subtle cues is management sending about what's important, what's
Mm-hmm.
not, so I've just always been fascinated with the complexity of how change
Yeah.
happens. And then got into sustainability, a big turning point in the late 90s at a conference in California
Mm-hmm.
with like Paul Hawken and Ray Anderson and all these kind of real innovators of the field at
Was
a
it
very early stage.
Pioneers by chance?
No, it wasn't Pioneers. It was
Okay.
called Ecotech, and it
Mm-hmm.
just blew my mind. And that was sort
Mm-hmm.
of my wake up call. And
Yeah.
I really got the bug around sustainability and how do we redesign and the scale of change of like the industrial, certain system needing to evolve towards some different, more holistic, healthy way of working with nature that
Mm-hmm.
works for people on the earth. So I quit my job and started a
Mm-hmm.
nonprofit called Sustainable
Yeah.
Step New England that was all around
Mm.
teaching people about sustainable principles in a way that they could take those and integrate them into their own organization
Mm-hmm.
and framing them as questions like how could the way we redesign our town hall use less fossil fuels, how could we restore the earth as we make a living doing this. So
Yeah.
very creative work with internal people motivated to make change. And so that part of my career I just loved. It was very entrepreneurial, based in
Yeah.
New England.
Mm-hmm.
And so that has really been a through line of like, how do we at each scale, whether it's our personal practices, how we work as teams, how we work as organizations and communities. And so that work then evolved to the next chapter of my work, which was that we're not going to solve this at the scale of one person or
Mm-hmm.
one organization.
Mm-hmm.
Like to change the scale of systems, we need to have collaborative networks and
Mm-hmm.
work towards systemic change. And frankly, I get so frustrated because I think there's just way too much at too small a scale. I call it
Mm-hmm.
kind of nonprofit narcissism. Like
Uh-huh.
everyone's trying to do their
Interesting.
own little piece, and it's
Great.
like we don't work together. So the last
Great.
10 years, I've done a lot around system change thinking and strategy and teaching
Mm-hmm.
leaders how to think systemically, how to understand participatory process and collaboration and host
Hmm.
meetings where you get
Yeah.
as much of the system in the room and get people interacting in very vibrant,
Hmm.
cross-pollinated ways. Like art of
Yeah.
hosting is a whole suite of practices I use a
Yeah.
lot. And
Mm.
then so along with that, then also I got really into social network theory and practice. So a
Hmm.
lot of the kinds of projects I've worked on is like a group, like working on local food systems and how can we create a collaborative network across all the different players that touch food and get them working together.
Hmm.
And so I do a lot of the strategy and the facilitated meetings and
Hmm.
that kind of work. So it's a lot helping the leaders see how they fit in the larger whole and building out the structures and the collaboration to actually go from the idea of it to how do you actually do it. Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah, beautiful. And different arc, you talked about what you saw initially, same problem, different places, to working at the nonprofit scale, to now seeing larger systems of change to some degree. Something you said earlier, I wanted to see, Beth, what your thoughts are around, you open your story up with, I've had the privilege of going to college. And
Hmm.
this question of how people can engage is something I wrestle with a lot in collaboratives, in creating change when they're struggling to put food on the table. Or maybe
Hmm.
when they are in a system that, they don't have um, the capacity or time. I think everyone has the capacity, just what does it take to bring that out? What have you, in your experience working with individuals or in the nonprofit or community scale, what has enabled, from your experience, people to engage when they are struggling to put food on the table or when it's hard to find care for kids or for elders? What's been your experience along those
It's a
lines?
great question, and I haven't, to be honest, I haven't seen a lot of groups that have done it well. I think
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of the times because I in the last years of my career I've been in a consulting facilitator role, so
Mm-hmm.
I'm often brought in by the foundations or the government agencies or the nonprofits. So we have all these organizations that are
Right.
helping those people, right? Like the people that are in the center of it.
Mm-hmm.
The work I'm most excited about is where those groups come in an accompaniment role, where they
Mm-hmm.
really come with the lens is not we're here to help or we have, back to nonprofit, we have our program and we can tell you what you need. It's much more centering the community, centering the people, creating the structures where you're coming in saying, what do you need and want? And then
Mm-hmm.
stipending, giving resources for the people in communities themselves to come up with the answers. And
Mm-hmm.
participatory grant making, different programs that really are trying to walk alongside people and give them the support, but knowing the resources are in the community, knowing all the answers are already there. It's just
Mm-hmm.
how do we, provide enough support for them to bring it forward. And that's the
Mm-hmm.
work I'm most excited by these days and
Yeah.
trying to emulate in my own work. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I love that. The theory of accompaniment. Couldn't agree with you more. And that's, as I mentioned when we spoke a couple days ago, a lot of the work that I do is in Appalachia, and that's what we've seen time and time again, especially this idea around resilience and community resilience. We've seen that it's built on the local ideas of local leaders, people coming together, having safe space. What does that look like? You talked about it being the work that excites you the most these days. What is it about it that excites you? And tell us a little bit more about what it looks like, whether that's the art of hosting or this, you talked about the social network theory. Like, what does that actually look like in everyday work and everyday life with folks?
Yeah, I think I've of late been also interested in just, how can we bridge across, difference, like even just in building friendships and building relationships. So,
Mm-hmm.
there's in my own life, there's a woman I have become friends with her. We just said, let's do a weekly call. And she's
Mm-hmm.
very on the ground connected in her community in New Hampshire with a lot of like refugees and immigrants and like very,
Mm-hmm.
different life experiences, but holding a call every week together,
Yeah.
just as different things come up in life. And
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there's an opportunity for a lot more of that to happen, like this switch from being so program oriented and project oriented
Mm-hmm.
towards being relational
Mm-hmm.
about the work we're doing and
Yeah.
focusing first on building relationship. So as I do social change facilitation these days, I have a little triangle, which I can send you a link to this blog, but it's at
Yeah.
the bottom. It's like foundation of connection and trust first.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's like aligning our work, and then there's learning together. like really listening and what's happened in that community. Like, for example, in a community that I was working with, we did a whole history wall exercise where we had a lot of the folks from the neighborhood. We were trying to come in, and we knew there'd been decades of nonprofits coming and going, we got a new program. Let's all get around the
Yeah,
table. And
right.
just to put up a history wall where you had
Hmm.
what was happening in families, in the community, and the larger country in this decade, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s, and then having people in the room at small group tables saying what were the significant events in our community, sharing with each other and getting it on a wall where you can see the patterns over time.
Hmm.
And you're honoring what actually has already happened and what they've lived through and what the
Hmm.
strengths are, in this way that too often we just show up and say, let's look forward, and we
Hmm.
ignore. Right, like, not only all the gifts and the strengths, but also what they've been through, right? That needs to
Hmm.
be acknowledged. So those are a
Hmm.
couple examples of
Yeah,
how
love that.
I'm bringing that into the design of the work. And then one
Yeah.
other thing I feel really strongly about that I do in all my work is a process where we have a design team.
Hmm.
So whatever I'm doing as part of the change, we have a team that we work with throughout, that includes representatives of the communities and the kind of roles we're working with.
Hmm.
And that's very collaborative and really calling forth what they think is needed, so
Hmm.
that you're kind of modeling the whole system being held by a microcosm. And then that group kind of is doing the sense making and figure out what's needed, and then doing the event and then saying, what did we learn? And
Hmm.
so very iterative process, listening every step of the way,
Yeah.
no sense of outcomes till you hear from the group, a lot of
Hmm.
principles like
Yeah, beautiful. I love that. It's, yeah, would agree 100% how much it's about relationships and trust. The
that. Mhm.
foundation, the core, all of it building up, it's about relationships and trust, and how interesting that's been to help foster that during COVID. How do we build? You talked about the weekly call with your friend and colleague that you've maintained. How do we do that? And um, I think just naming the importance of building relationships and trust, and it's going to take time in different ways, and in a lot of projects I work on, it's just taking that time for that. What's your favorite summer memory type of conversation at the beginning of a call, so folks get to know that, oh, you're getting married next month, that's so cool, and the things that we just don't catch in
Yeah.
person. When you look ahead, Beth, to where you're headed with your work, I know you talked a little bit, and we spoke a few days ago about a new project you have coming up called Kinship. Where are you headed next? What work are you weaving in the world in the coming years?
Sure. Yeah, so the vehicle I've been doing my work with as self-employed is called New Directions Collaborative, that I was doing a lot of that collaborative network, social system change work through. In the last couple years during the COVID time, like a lot of people, for me, it was big because I stopped traveling. And
Mm-hmm.
that,
Yeah.
even though I'd scaled back from
Mm-hmm.
airplane travel towards regional, I didn't realize till everything slowed down how much I needed. And I've always wanted to root more in one place and build the community. So with kinship, I was recognizing, you have enough conversations over years about what's broken,
Mm-hmm.
and so many different things go back to, we're a little too alone, we're too self-focused, we're too isolated from each other.
Mm-hmm.
Even people, kindred spirits, are
Mm-hmm.
not connected in the
Mm-hmm.
ways that really feed and nourish the work.
Yeah.
And I kept recognizing the work's too fragmented, and so that we need certain things that are missing. And so what I want to do with kinship, this new initiative I'm doing as part of New
Yeah.
Directions, is to really provide spaces for the people doing this kind of holding the community work, kind of also seeing what's possible. Friend of mine, Libby Hoffman, calls it wholeness visionaries,
Mm-hmm.
working
Mm-hmm.
in this way, creating the spaces for them to come together and
Mm-hmm.
receive support and care, right? That peer to peer, not daily work with a project task, but just space to, like, where are you going? What do you need?
Mm-hmm.
Supporting each other.
Mm-hmm.
So that, and as well as taking all the methods that I've honed over time of how do you build trust in a group? How do you design good events? And really break those down and teach a whole lot of people those tools. Like, instead
Mm-hmm.
of me doing the work, I'm kind of at the
Mm-hmm.
level I really want to teach a lot of people to
Yeah.
experience what's
Yeah.
possible, and just be more. I'm starting my own podcast soon, so this is good to
Yeah.
be part of it. But just
Mm-hmm.
bringing forth the stories of what's possible, and I'm really big on the practical tools of what we need to unlearn,
Mm-hmm.
from the way we down do it, and what we need to learn, and what spaces we need to add in alongside the work, so that uh, that we can all sustain ourselves in it. And also that what you've probably seen too is that so much good stuff's happening, but we don't connect it across sectors and
Mm-hmm.
places. So we're
Mm-hmm.
all kind of evolving towards similar solutions and ways of working, but when you get people all doing the same thing but in different places together, it's like that's just such rich learning,
Mm-hmm.
nourishing
Absolutely.
spaces, and we
Yeah.
need a lot more of those spaces, I
Mm-hmm.
think.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that. I love that. Will you tell us at maybe like an everyday tool level, what are some of the things that you're finding has been most helpful or full of impact for people to unlearn and then to learn? What spaces or tools are you
Mhm.
really hoping to help nurture with kinship as you move forward?
I would say the unlearning, I have to work a lot with folks on this training that they need to have the answers and that to be professional, they should have it all figured out. And where do you want to be in 5 years?
Mm-hmm.
That actually the most powerful thing is to be in the not knowing. And so
Mm-hmm.
the my number one favorite tool uh, is I have several, but one of them, the one I use the most is called strategic questions. And I've found that to be the doorway in to learn, having people learn how to be more in a learning space, how to be in a space of inviting the group to find the answers.
Mm-hmm.
So the whole art of how do you frame good open questions. So an example, I did a collaborated helped host a community conversation at a big socially responsible business conference in my state.
Mm-hmm.
200 people hadn't met since COVID. So did a lot of work with the team ahead of time, like what would be the most powerful question to get people in small groups talking about.
Mm-hmm.
And we landed on this question of, given everything you just went through the last 2 years, what capabilities and possibilities emerged from that?
Hmm.
And so you can hear that's like a really reflective question that
Mm-hmm.
slightly, it acknowledges what we've been through, gets people to learn from the past, but in a positive frame.
Mm-hmm.
And, inviting people to each share a story. So you can
Mm-hmm.
see like one question or what's the most important conversation we're not having.
Hmm.
Or I'm doing a conference in a few weeks where we got to the question of how can the arts be used for healing and social change. So you can
Hmm.
hear they're powerful questions
Mm-hmm.
and you don't have to have the answer. And we come
Yeah.
as a group and find the answer. So it really opens it up to emergence, opens it up to, oh, I can show up and just invite the group to help, find the answer. Yeah.
I love that. I love that. And the importance of talking about the past, I think, is so freeing. I think so many people, in my experience, you talked about this a little bit, feel like until they're really heard and held with what their story is, especially at the community scale, what was, it's really hard to envision what the future is going to be or feel like what that is. And so, just the art of experience the gritty, muddy, dirty conversation about what was and acknowledging together and being held allows this new space for freshness. What are you finding, Beth, in your work with communities or individuals? What's helping them? A lot of people are really in a place of struggle, it seems like, just so much of what's been happening, like just deeply feeling downtrodden. And that feeling of getting to emergence or getting to I heard an interview with Brene Brown. She used the term collective effervescence. I just love that term so much. But there's a certain magic that sometimes needs to take place for an individual or a group to get there. What do you find has been really helpful in recent months in your work with people to be able to acknowledge the struggle, to acknowledge where we've been the last few years, but then also to hold vision and dream what's possible, find ways to make that a reality in their work? What are you seeing?
I see, uh, I love where the question's coming from because it's so aligned with my experience. I feel like we need some space before you can talk about the future. You really need some space for people to be heard. And I'm really doing a lot now in my work of training people to listen. And I've been Sarah Payton, who does a lot with resonant language and the neuroscience, relational neuroscience. There's
Mm,
fascinating research about how our nervous systems and our whole bodies are constantly reacting to each other. And so there are ways you can listen where people really feel heard and
mm,
understood. And
mm,
I feel like that's critical. It's critical for mental health. And there's so many ways we can be be transactionally saying, what do you think? Okay, I got that. Do you think you want this? Or like there's so much sort of asking
Surface.
questions just for a poll, right? It's like,
Mm-hmm.
no, I genuinely want to know your experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then resonating with it, like acknowledging back, wow, that sounds like you're just on a tightrope, or that's, like being able to use metaphor and these ways where if people can tell their stories and be heard genuinely, and there's ways where you can bring those stories together to see the systemic nature of it, because that's the
Mm-hmm.
other part of
Yeah.
being so individualistic. It's like such a huge burden on us
I
individual,
suppose.
these
Totally.
systemic things are the problem, but we're all like like a friend of mine's trying to navigate the emergency room with her father. And she's like, the system is so broken. Like it shouldn't be this hard. Right. So we're all in that, but we don't yet see how do we find the solidarity in that. And then so I'm really big now also on this idea of resourcing each other so
Mm-hmm.
that a friend who's going into a really hard meeting, it's like, I'm going to gather 3 or 4 colleagues the couple days before, and we're going to just do a session to like help her prep and get her ready and be like, we got your back. And at two
Mm,
o'clock, we're all texting, going, we're on your far away team. We got
love
you.
that.
Like that level of peer support. Like there's so much possible we don't even do because we're just in our little individual box. Yeah.
Totally. Yes, I love that. And even naming the space, Beth, like I have a strong network of folks here, but even as my work with facilitation, I can feel this like ping in my heart, like, oh, that sounds so good, of just like, yes, let's cultivate that. So
Yeah.
I think that that naming it creates the space for seeing it, for acknowledging the need for it. And sometimes, there is so much that's broken, and sometimes just the space to like, just name something new allows us to see what's possible. Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that.
And so to finish up on the earlier question,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, so like if you can spend as much time as you need in the what is it, like what's it like, how's it feel? And I am doing more these days with different ways of seeing systems and embodying systems. So we get out of just thinking and talking
Mm-hmm.
about it all the
Gosh,
time.
yes.
So even making a visual of it, and it's like, oh, how does this relate to that? Right. So that you're helping people remember they're part of an ecosystem. That's the other big
Mm.
thing in my
Yeah.
work is, oh, it's not just I'm alone. It's these parts affect each other. They relate. That the history before has affected what's here. Like spending enough time in that space, then and as you do it in ways that build trust and care, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm holding
Mm-hmm.
your story now.
Mm-hmm.
And your story connected to that story and that moment that you got teary and I was just here with you. Like all of that then is like a crucible that can then allow something to emerge and
Mm-hmm.
allow that it naturally I find it naturally opens if you have people doing storytelling, but feeling held in a is I know safe space is a quote, but like everything they experience in that space gives them cues of safety psychologically,
Mm-hmm.
physiologically.
Mm-hmm.
It can I've seen it. It just shifts. People start
Mm-hmm.
to move into that.
Yeah.
What I if I had $1 million, what I would want to see most is that funders and those who care about things consistently fund these kind of spaces
Mm-hmm.
for 20 years,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because I
Mm-hmm.
think what's been heartbreaking in my work and partly why I was just had to shift out of consulting to some extent is that I just kept doing all that wonderful foundational work with people, getting them to trust and hope and dream. And then like
Right.
it'll be like, oh, we have a new mayor and we're going to stop that
Right.
program or decided to shift our strategy and we're not going to fund that. And as a consultant, I'm kind of at the mercy of like the
Mm-hmm.
funding structures in that way.
Right.
So I think there's a huge need for a stability of funding. It's like the soil. Like, do you want to invest in the soil that nourishes the work and the people? Or do you want to just keep trying to grow some little plant and then uproot it and start over? Right. That's kind
Mm-hmm.
of what we do right now,
Mm-hmm.
I think.
Yeah,
I don't know
so
if you'd see
true.
it that way, but it's
Well,
just,
it's interesting. I very much resonate with what you said, and made a shift a couple years ago where just the short term, even technical assistance work or short term facilitation, I just don't feel like it has lasting oomph. And so the work that most lights me up is the long term, large scale collaborative work. And I mean, you're really in it then in the trenches, in multi years, figuring things out. What do we need to do next? But then it's really, once those relationships can deepen, the work can become so much more rich. And
mhm.
that's where it feels like the ability to move the needle is really there. Um, And so I think it's both. I think sometimes it is that short term idea, inspiration, spark, change. But I think
Mhm.
also the foundation of the ongoing work has been really powerful.
Yeah.
But that's what I've really found the most joy in professionally is that long term work, and totally the funders being committed to that long term work. So
So
key.
important. Mhm.
So I love what you've shared about, you've talked about specific tools, the power of holding space, seeing each other, letting each other know that we see them, we hold them, following up when we know something is important in someone's life, and building that continuity, creating spaces where folks can feel supported and held. And I love the analogy of building soil. Beth, can you talk just a little bit more um, about really within your own community or life about what's really helped to grow resilience, create a sense of belonging? Anything else you want to share about what's really helped your community be strong? Kind of coming back to this theme of community resilience a little bit.
Mhm.
That could be in your own work or life too. I'll let you go with that one.
Yeah. I mean, I might just tell a personal story because it's
Yeah.
also the
Mm-hmm.
root of why I kind of like felt I needed to do this kinship as my focus in a way, the relationship as the focus. So I was able, sorry, in my early 30s, I fell in love with this wonderful man named Rick, and we were together about 5 years and got engaged. And he was a person who walked through the world and with a much of the spirit that we're talking about. Like, he had just this way
Mm-hmm.
of seeing you and drawing you out, and he would really believe in you more than you did yourself sometimes, that way of
Mm-hmm.
loving people. And so
Yeah.
just to be loved by him, get to love him, see how he loved all his friends and how they grew in his presence. It was just one of my life gifts. And
Mm.
sadly, right as we were finishing building a house and moving in together, like, he got cancer, and
Mm.
it turned out to be terminal, and
Oh,
which we didn't know at the time. So we're just deep in the fight
yeah.
in a time where we are just completely overwhelmed with how much we had going on. And our friends and family rallied in such a remarkable way.
Mm.
It was just incredible. Like, they organized a whole planning committee, and friends from college and my sister and his, like, people just self-organized to find all these ways to support me and Rick when we were in such an
Mm.
hour of need. I mean, and making videos that would delight him, or getting his favorite bagels from New York shipped to New Hampshire. I mean, like, giving us
Mhm.
rides to the hospital. And then, it sadly, he, is a terminal case of cancer, but even through him dying, and then the way we self-organized, the ways to honor him, and
Mm.
the way that community supported me through my grieving, it was just this profound understanding of how we can be there for each other in community.
Mm.
And it's like nature. I mean, I think when we're in the village in our best, there's a spontaneity to how we are with each other that we
Mhm.
just, once we have the place and the connection to care, like, we don't need strategic plans. We don't need grants. We don't, nature doesn't strategic
Yeah.
plan how a
Right.
meadow is going to evolve. And so
Mm.
I think there's just this part of me that's like, how do we get back to that?
Mm.
And I know when people are given a good experiences of it, just growing what we need, it's like, we need to do this. Let's create the soil. Let's, like, create the spaces for people to be human
Mhm.
in nice ways. They will. It's just we have
Mhm.
all this stuff in the
Yeah.
way from
Yeah.
the old that,
Yeah.
and let alone like the media and all these things that are, kind of inherently divide us. How do we recreate experiences like that where people taste it and then, like, I want more, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. What a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing that. And
You're
what the
welcome. Yeah.
experience of being held, like seen and held and cared for, how that's informed so much of your work, it sounds like, from that
Yeah.
time of your life with Rick. Mm,
Mhm.
so beautiful.
Yeah, and I feel like, to me, in COVID, what's so hard is, it's another part of, back to your question of, like, how do we hold the past so that something in the future can look different? And,
Hmm.
and so there's a whole piece of that that's so important with this work, which
Hmm.
is the grief. And that,
Hmm.
I mean, I remember talking with a man I met who is from Egypt, and as I had gone through it, a friend of mine had called me a grief warrior, because she's like, "You
Mm.
just leaned into the grief, and, when things are hard, you just went with it. You didn't cut off." And this friend of mine from Egypt, he was scratching his head. He's like, "We in my country, grief is so collective." It's
Mm.
always done in community and singing and, like, he's like, "I can't get my arms around individual
Yeah.
grief." And I was like, "Wow." I mean, that's just something in our culture we don't do
Right.
very well, right?
We don't do it all really. I mean, we do this like, bring a meal and like acknowledge, send a card, show up. But then in terms of like I mean, grief is a long-term process. What does it look like a year later, a month later? I had an
Mhm.
experience this spring where I was talking about a really difficult experience I had in the spring. And excuse me, when I was a teenager, I was talking in the springtime about that story, about a very hard time in my life. And I'm 44 now, so it's like almost 30 years later. And I've like packaged this like story up for like 30 years of like, this is part of who I am. And it's like hard. And I'll talk about it sometimes, but it's so painful still. And the person I was talking to was like, that experience is a gift for like even to still mine the compost or like the learning from that. And it just like humanized it so much for me. It's not that there's any less pain there, but it's like, of course, we all go through hard things and traumatic things. And it's like, it is a gift. And it's something that if I hold it onto myself, it's this precious pain. Where if I create it we all experience pain. And
Mhm.
if I can share that out and like just make it, oh, it's so hard and you've experienced hard and it's like sometimes it's hard together, it takes the singularity of the pain out and just makes it more like this collective. And that's what can for me, allows the transformation to happen is
Yeah.
the sharing of it to some degree. And it was a kind of a revelatory moment for me of I don't have to hold on to it with so much, this is my pain, my past is like, yeah, really painful, yep, still stuff to learn from it, not to diminish it at all, but just
Mhm.
to make it part of just the experience of my life. So fascinating, and such a different way to look at pain. So the sense of collective grief feels such a sense for me of like potential for relief or release or not holding it alone.
Well, and yeah, I really appreciate that understanding of her, that feeling. The other thing that's possible with, back to the relational neuroscience, is that when we're really resonating with someone and really with them in what was hard, like if we were to unpack, and we're not going to do it on the podcast, but like
Right.
it through the story, and I'm maybe even a small circle breathing with you through it, where we actually are feeling it with you. This is all
Mm-hmm.
possible.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, the idea, and I've experienced this a lot with some of these other healing modalities that I've been doing with groups, is you can share nervous systems in a sense. So one
Hmm.
definition of trauma is something that was too difficult for that one person to bear by themselves. Like they didn't
Mm-hmm.
have enough resource to handle it. So,
Mm-hmm.
like if you have a really hard event, but like your mom, let's say it was like your child, but your mom was there and she was a mom who could be present with you and just like
Right.
with you where you could be held and cry your way through it. And she's kind of feeling it too, right? Then it can move through us.
Yeah.
Right. But when we hold it by ourselves, we get into overwhelm and shut it down and bury it.
Right.
So this is a whole new, it's another part of why kinship, I think there's all these ways in groups we can hold way more, but because we're so hyper individual, it's all these things that are these gifts beyond the pattern.
Mm-hmm.
If we could come out of individualism to realize there's all these other things out there, and it's not new, it's indigenous people's
Mm-hmm.
practices through time. It's dancing, it's
Mm-hmm.
drumming, it's, healing circles, all this stuff exists. And I feel if we go down to the root of why we're so troubled right now, it's we have layers of frozen grief, you
Mm-hmm.
know, holding it, like you're saying, in my little case,
Mm-hmm.
that can be moved.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And it's that, how do we build trust and there's I guess the other piece we haven't even gone to, but it's like self trust too, that I know that I have the capacity or space to be big enough to hold it, and with others and but it's taken me a long time to really deepen my own sense of self trust too,
Mhm.
and not feeling like I'll be overwhelmed by something to the point where I can still move through it. It's fascinating,
Which
but
to
like,
me still comes back to like self-trust still assumes you have to do it yourself almost, so it's like,
Hmm.
what is the trust in that I will be held by reliable people,
Yeah.
right? To
Right.
Because part of why we can't move it is it's too much to bear.
Yeah.
Understandably,
Hmm.
like we are just little
Totally.
beings, and the scale
Right.
what's happening in the
World.
planet is like way too much for us. If our hearts are at all open, the scale of species destruction and the
Yeah.
violence, I mean, so to me, the next wave of if we want to cope is solidarity, is,
Hmm.
community collective. You had also asked about methods. I do these quarterly collective resourcing gatherings
Mm.
of
Love
people
that.
deep in the change. And we just come together for a day and take one person's challenge and work with that and do small groups. And it's possible to just hold this stuff together
Yeah.
in ways, as different people have needs, we can be there for each other. And it's one of the
Hmm.
most beautiful ways to be human together that
Mm.
we're missing out on because we're all like, oh,
Yeah.
I shouldn't burden anyone with my
Mm.
challenges,
Yeah.
right?
The
Yeah.
being with, just the aim of being with.
Yeah. And but that said, if we acknowledging there's a lot of toxic environments and people, that it's a wise thing to not share a lot if you're not
Yeah.
with a group that's capable of holding it in a
Yeah.
caring, warm way, right? So I
Hmm.
want to name that you
Hmm.
got to kind of develop the group capacity in a way that it makes sense for you to trust. It's
Absolutely.
all
Absolutely.
related.
I love it. Absolutely. That foundation is key and is what will allow the transformation to happen. So I just so resonate with so much of what you're saying and could continue the broad scale conversation for a long time. But I do want to move into um, as we're getting ready to close soon, some quick roller questions about you and life.
Okay.
Um, so Beth, tell us what brings you joy.
Uh, let's I would say what brings me joy is being with people where you get to emergence, where you're really
Mm,
deep in a conversation and each piece that people have brought like brings you to some new insight or understanding that
mm,
could only arise out of the combination. So
mm.
that those are some of my most joyful times.
I love that. One of my mentors, often talks about synergy in collective spaces. He's a facilitator, a mediator, but the term emergence really speaks to the we so much.
Mhm.
Beautifully. Love that. We've talked about this a little bit, some, but what keeps you moving forward on the days you struggle?
Uh, well, I've started a practice that I learned from a Native American woman, Diana Longboat, which is get up every morning at sunrise and just
Hmm.
go greet the sun and really connect to all the dimension, all the relatives in a way. And that
Hmm.
has helped me tremendously. It's just something around seeing the sun every morning and reminding myself of that fundamental abundance that's flowing through, as well as the scale of 93 million miles away, and
Hmm.
still warming my face, like just putting it's like a humility within the larger whole that
Mm.
I've come to it in just the last few years, and it's actually a healing from activism that I've had to
Hmm.
do, because like all this
Hmm.
you should save the earth and you have the ability
Right.
to change everything is way overweighted
Hmm.
compared to what we could
Hmm.
each do. So
Hmm.
I think I've been really leaning into nature as a resource when I'm having a hard time, and just that truth that there's so many people working on the change we're trying to do. And if I'm
Hmm.
not working on the climate thing right now, I know some other people are working on voting rights, and every pretty issue, people are working on it. It's like I don't
Hmm.
have to do everything.
Hmm. Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, release from holding it all.
Yeah.
And grounding back into nature and the lessons that or the offerings. Yeah, I love that. So you've talked about the scale of change that you've seen over time, creating systems level change. What key lessons learned would you share with others who are working to create change in their communities and region?
Mm. I feel like the what I feel is so important, I mentioned it a bit earlier, is really having your mates, your hosting team, your friends and collaborators at the center of whatever you're trying to do, and having that consistent hosting team that knows and trusts each other and that really works well together. um, I feel like that it sustains me personally. It makes the
Mm-hmm.
work much more a joy. We finish each other's sentences. I write the agenda, and my friend Nancy's like, "We're trying to do too much." I'm like, "I knew you were going to say that," like that.
Mhm. Mhm.
That 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 experience and feels to me like one of the simplest ways to sustain the work, and it's integral. Like we talk about, it takes a field to host a field. So the small group
Mhm.
microcosm that is clear, gets coherence, and works through all the complexity to say this is what we need to do in this meeting, and then the larger group can come into a coherent space in a way.
Mhm.
So
Mhm.
that would be probably the biggest thing I would say, and then just uh, from a personal thing, the other one I didn't say is just having, I have a pretty large list of close friends that
Mhm.
are phone call away when I'm like, I'm
Yeah.
tipping into the self-doubt cycle. I know it well, and
Yeah.
they'll just like fish me out,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
I do that
Love
for them.
that.
So
Yeah. Yeah. That's great.
having friends, I mean, I get out quicker now, but I feel
Yeah.
like we all, and that's where like a standing weekly call or weekly walk, I feel those methods are really important.
So
Yeah.
key. Yeah, so key. Love that. And what do you wish someone told you 5 or 10 years ago about this work? It's related to the key lessons, but anything that you would reflect on?
Well, I guess I've been I've been on a pretty deep learning journey on anti-racism and equity, and unraveling. I mean, I'm deep in white culture, and I
Mm,
grown up, in the suburbs, and so like it's the water you're swimming in. And
mm,
so I think the recognition of I to do well and be professional in all this, there's a way we also talk about as being the good girl. Like I will cue into what the system says is okay and what isn't okay. But there's all these methods and tools and ways of being outside what the system you grew up in says is okay, right? That
mm-hmm,
are incredibly powerful. And it took
mm,
me a while to get comfortable enough to walk over into those spaces and be like, what's this healing modality?
mm-hmm,
What's that?
mm.
Because it'd be like, well, these corporate people would be like, kumbaya, what's that? Right? That boundary. I call it the boundary of kumbaya, where it's like that's so
Yeah.
I feel like once I found what was on the other side of all these other things, and we also could talk about in terms of feminine, the more
Mm-hmm,
emotional, embodied things that if you're in the very rational, intellectual way that we do a lot, you'd be like, that's out there, right? So I
mm-hmm.
feel like I would have, I mean, I'm grateful I did go where I went, but if I were to like develop, that's partly why I want to develop tools that are like, you can step over here, look over there, there's more.
I love that. I love
Yeah.
that. So, along that theme of stepping over there, how can people learn more about your work? We'll include links to everything in the show notes and the website, but how can folks find out about kinship? And I just welcome any other thoughts or reflections you'd like to share as we get ready to wrap up.
Thank you. So I have a new website for kinship that's called kinshiphub.net, and I'm doing a workshop coming up all about the questions. So if you liked that,
Mm,
it's a 3-part series about coming up with the right question and how that can be the center of the way you host everything. So there'll
mm-hmm,
be other workshops and events online with that, and some in person I'm in southern New Hampshire, about an hour north of Boston. And then I also have kept my website for New Directions Collaborative, and that we'll put in the show notes too. And that website, I kept up a blog for about, I don't know, 8 or 10 years.
mm-hmm,
And so there's a lot of good blogs on there if you're
mm,
doing this work
great.
that I wrote
Mm-hmm,
as I was doing the work, kind of this is what we learned. This is the project I was inspired by.
great.
So I
Awesome.
still refer back to those a lot. So
Mm-hmm,
I would definitely, and there's a category list, and then there's a very in-depth resource page on there
mm,
on both websites now, full of resources and links to methods. And, so I think I love to share out resources. So I would
mm-hmm.
definitely encourage you to check that one out. And if you sign up for the kinship newsletter, you'll get updates on events and offerings. So some are
Awesome.
online and some are local.
Great. I love that. So we'll make sure to
And
include
I'm
all
starting a
those.
podcast soon.
Yes, and the
So.
podcast, tell us when that's going to come out. How can folks find it?
Oh, good question. I think within the next couple months, and the
Great.
podcast is called Living Love. And so
Mm,
my
beautiful.
vision of it, sort of inspired by the Rick story, is I want to kind of have 20 or 30 minutes of storytelling and then have a guest or two where we'll be reflecting on the stories and the themes together in unscripted conversation. So
Yeah,
that's the vision of
beautiful.
it.
I
Yeah.
love it. Well, excited to keep an eye out for that. So,
Thank
anything
you.
else you'd like to share before we wrap up?
Oh, I'm just want to say thank you to everyone listening and to you for hosting this conversation. And I just feel that I love the image of the mycelial networks,
Mm-hmm.
the root networks that are happening all over the country right now and all over the world, of so many people kind of digging in and growing the roots of what is the system to come, what is the ways we're going to be, like, with throw off empire and all these broken things. So
Yeah.
it's just such a joy to be in conversation and know that there's so many people having the same conversations and dreaming into what's possible. And
Mm-hmm.
I feel like we're the root network a bit right now. Like, you don't fully
Mm-hmm.
see it, but we're going to
Mm-hmm.
grow a lot of new things in
Yeah.
the future based
I
on
love
all the kind of foundational practices and ways that we're connecting right now.
that.
That you haven't seen it yet, but it's coming. That's my view. That's my optimistic closing statement.
I love that. Root network
Yeah.
is such just a great image that resonates. So,
Yeah.
Beth, thanks so much for joining the We Rise
Thank
podcast.
you.
It's been such a delight to have you, and I'm excited to see where the podcast goes for you and other things. So, definitely stay tuned. So, thanks again.
Thank you so much. It's been a joy.